welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 deeply unsettling stories from the frozen wilderness of Minnesota. These are accounts from people who ventured into the snow-covered woods and abandoned places, only to discover that some things should remain buried beneath the winter drifts. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The cabin near Boundary Waters had been in my family since the 50s, though I'd only been there twice as a kid. My Uncle Henrik used to take care of it, checking on the place every few weeks during winter, making sure the roof hadn't collapsed under snow. When he died last February, nobody wanted the responsibility. I was 29 between jobs, and I figured a week alone up there would give me time to think about what I was doing with my life. The drive from Duluth took 4 hours, the last 30 minutes on logging roads that hadn't been plowed in weeks. My Subaru handled it, but barely. I arrived around 3 in the afternoon, that gray kind of winter light that makes everything look washed out. The cabin was exactly like I remembered, just smaller somehow. 1 room, wood stove, a loft for sleeping. I'd brought enough food for 10 days, extra propane, more firewood than I'd probably need. The wind was picking up when I unloaded the car, and I noticed the trees around the cabin had grown in closer than I remembered. They pressed right up against the clearing, thick pines with branches that scraped the roof when the wind gusted. That first night was fine, cold but manageable. I got the fire going, heated up some soup, read a paperback I'd been meaning to finish for months. It was around 10 when I heard the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the door. I assumed it was a branch, maybe ice falling from the roof. But when I opened the door to check, there was nothing, just darkness and falling snow and the shapes of trees swaying. The knock came again while I stood there, and I realized it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from underneath the cabin. I told myself it was the wood settling, expanding and contracting with the cold. Old cabins made all kinds of sounds. I went back inside, locked the door even though I knew it was pointless, and tried to keep reading. The knocking continued, irregular now. Sometimes it would stop for 20 minutes and I'd start to relax. Then it would start again, always from below. I remembered my uncle mentioning a crawl space under the cabin, just enough room for storage and to keep the pipes from freezing. I'd never been down there. Neither had I as far as I could recall. Around midnight, the knocking stopped completely. The silence felt worse somehow. I climbed up to the loft, wrapped myself in 2 sleeping bags, and tried to convince myself I was being ridiculous. I must have dozed off because I woke suddenly to the sound of something dragging across the floor below me. Long, slow scrapes like someone pulling heavy canvas. Then it stopped directly beneath where I was lying. I didn't move. My breath was fogging in the cold air of the loft, and I could hear my pulse hammering in my ears. The dragging sound came again, slower this time. And then I heard breathing, not wind, not the cabin settling. Breath. Long, wet inhales followed by longer exhales. It was right below me, separated only by the planks of the loft floor. I stayed frozen like that for what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes. The breathing eventually stopped. Slowly, quietly, I pulled out my phone. No signal, which I'd expected. The battery was at 60%. It was 2:47 a.m. I took a photo of the loft floor beneath me. I don't know why. The flash lit up the space for a second, harsh and white. The scraping started again immediately, faster now, moving toward the ladder. I could hear it on the rungs. Whatever was climbing toward me wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. I saw fingers first, gripping the top of the ladder. They were too long, too pale, the nails dark and cracked. Then the top of a head, hair matted with something I couldn't identify in the darkness. It was pulling itself up into the loft with me. I didn't think. I grabbed the propane lantern from beside my sleeping bag and threw it. The thing dropped back down with a sound like wet meat hitting wood. I scrambled down the ladder, not caring if I fell, grabbed my keys from the table and ran for the door. My boots were still by the wood stove. I left them. The snow outside was knee-deep and my socks soaked through immediately, but I kept running, stumbling toward where I'd parked the Subaru. The engine turned over on the second try. I reversed blindly, clipped a tree, didn't care. The cabin lights were still on, and through the window I could see movement inside. Something was standing in the main room watching me leave. It was tall enough that its head nearly touched the ceiling beams, and it was perfectly still. I drove for 2 hours before my hands stopped shaking enough to pull over at a gas station in Ely. I called my cousin Rebecca, told her I'd had a panic attack and needed to get out of there. She didn't ask too many questions. I never went back for my stuff. 3 months later, I was going through photos on my phone and found the picture I'd taken in the loft. In the image, there's a gap between 2 floorboards I hadn't noticed before. Something pale is visible through the gap, pressed against the underside of the floor. Watching up, the cabin's still in my family's name. Nobody wants to sell it, but I've made it clear I'm never setting foot in Boundary Waters again. Story 2. I moved to International Falls in 2019 to work at the paper mill. The pay was decent, and I was trying to save money after a divorce that had cleaned me out pretty thoroughly. The apartment I could afford was on the north edge of town, one of those old fourplexes that probably should have been condemned 20 years ago. My landlord was a guy named Dmitry Volkov, who owned half the rental properties in town and didn't fix anything unless you threatened to call the city. The apartment was on the ground floor, which I liked. What I didn't like was the window in the bedroom that faced the woods. Not a backyard, just trees starting about 10 feet from the building. The glass was old, single pane, and I could feel cold air leaking around the frame even with the heat on. I mentioned it to Dmitry twice. He brought weather stripping and didn't install it. Said he'd get to it next week. He never did. It was early December when I first noticed the handprint. I'd been living there about 4 months. I woke up on a Saturday morning and there it was on the outside of the bedroom window. A full handprint in the frost, fingers spread wide. I went outside in my bathrobe to look at it, thinking maybe some kid had been messing around, but the print was high up, at least 7 feet off the ground, and there were no footprints in the snow beneath the window. None. Just that one handprint, perfectly preserved in the frost. I took a photo of it, showed it to my coworker Marcus Chen at the mill on Monday. He laughed, said it was probably from when the window was installed and only showed up now because of the temperature. That made enough sense that I let it go. The print melted by afternoon anyway. It came back the next night. Same position, same height. This time I checked immediately, walking around the building in my boots and jacket. No tracks anywhere near that window. No ladder marks in the snow. Nothing. I called Dmitry, got his voicemail, left a message that probably sounded crazier than I intended. He never called back. The third night I stayed up, positioned myself in the living room with a view of the bedroom doorway and that window beyond it. I had the TV on low, some late-night talk show I wasn't really watching. It was around 2:30 a.m. when the temperature in the apartment dropped. Not gradually, just suddenly colder, like someone had opened a door to the outside. My breath started fogging. The TV flickered once, twice, then the picture stabilized. I stood up and that's when I saw it. There was a shape outside the window, tall, pressed against the glass, one hand raised to the pane. The frost formed around the hand as I watched, spreading outward in crystalline patterns. The shape was person-sized, but wrong somehow. The proportions weren't right. The head was too narrow, tilted at an angle that made my stomach turn. I couldn't move. I stood there in my living room, watching this thing watch me through 2 panes of glass and 20 feet of space. It didn't move either, just stood there with its hand against the glass, its head cocked to that awful angle. I could see breath fogging the window from the outside, long, slow breaths that matched my own. The standoff lasted maybe a minute, maybe 5. Then it moved, not away but closer. It pressed its face against the glass and I saw features that weren't quite features. Pale skin stretched over bone, eyes that didn't reflect the apartment lights right, a mouth that was pressed into a thin line but looked too wide. Then it smiled and I saw teeth, too many teeth. I ran for the bedroom, slammed the door, pushed my dresser against it, grabbed my phone and called 911. The dispatcher asked what my emergency was and I couldn't explain it. I said someone was trying to break in, which wasn't exactly true but wasn't exactly false either. She said she'd send the unit. I stayed barricaded in the bedroom until I saw the police lights flashing through the window. 2 officers came, walked around the building with their flashlights, checked the window. They found the handprint, took a photo. No other evidence, no tracks. They asked if I'd been drinking, if I was on any medications, if I had a history of mental health issues. I said no to all of it, which was true. They suggested I get better locks and maybe invest in a security system. They left around 4 a.m. The handprint was still there in the morning. I packed a bag and checked into the Super 8 on the highway, called Dimitri from the motel and told him I was breaking my lease. He argued, threatened to keep my deposit, said I was crazy. I told him he could keep the deposit and everything else. I left International Falls the next day, drove all the way to Minneapolis, and stayed with my sister until I found a new job. 3 weeks later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, there was just breathing on the other end, long, slow breaths. I hung up and blocked the number. It's been 5 months, and sometimes I still wake up thinking I hear breathing outside whatever window is nearest to my bed. I've started sleeping with the curtains drawn always, but I know it doesn't matter, because last week I found a handprint on my bathroom mirror from the inside. Story 3. My best friend Claudia Winters and I decided to go snowshoeing in the Superior National Forest on a Tuesday in January. We both had the day off and the forecast was clear. We'd been talking about doing something outdoorsy for months, and this felt like the perfect opportunity. Claudia had grown up in Eveleth, knew the area pretty well. I'd only moved to Minnesota 2 years before for a teaching job in Virginia. We picked a trail that was supposed to be moderate, about 6 miles round trip, ending at an old fire lookout tower. The parking lot was empty when we arrived around 9 in the morning, which Claudia said was normal for a weekday in January. The trailhead had one of those wooden signs with carved letters, Wickstrom Ridge Trail. Someone had scratched something into the wood below the official text, but it was too weathered to read clearly. The first hour was beautiful. Snow-covered pines, complete silence except for our snowshoes crunching, the occasional bird call. We talked about work, about Claudia's boyfriend who she was thinking about breaking up with, about my student loans that would outlive me at the rate I was paying them. Normal stuff. The trail was well marked with blue blazes on trees every 100 feet or so. Around mile 2, we stopped for water and granola bars. That's when Claudia pointed out the markers ahead. They weren't blue anymore. They were red. Hand-painted, crude, not like the official trail blazes at all. She said she didn't remember the trail changing colors, pulled out her phone to check the map she'd downloaded. The trail on the map was still showing blue blazes. We were standing right where we should be according to GPS. I suggested maybe they'd repainted the markers and just hadn't updated the map. Claudia wasn't convinced, but we kept going. The red markers continued, spaced out the same as the blue ones had been. After another 20 minutes, we came to a clearing we definitely shouldn't have reached yet. In the center was a structure that wasn't on any map, not the fire tower we'd been heading toward. This was low to the ground, partially buried in snow, a cabin maybe or a bunker. The door was metal and had no handle, just a heavy padlock that looked new. We stood at the edge of the clearing, not moving closer. Something about the building made my throat tight. Claudia whispered that we should turn back, and I agreed immediately. When we turned around, though, the trail we'd come from looked different. The red markers were still there, but they were on the wrong trees. The spacing was off, and our snowshoe tracks were gone, not covered by fresh snow, just gone. The snow behind us was smooth and untouched. Claudia started walking faster, following the red markers back the way we thought we'd come. I stayed close behind her. Neither of us spoke. After 10 minutes, we came to another clearing. The same clearing. The same buried structure with the metal door. We de-walked in a circle somehow, even though we'd been following a straight trail. That's when we heard the singing. A woman's voice, high and clear, coming from somewhere in the trees. It wasn't in English, maybe Swedish, maybe Norwegian. Claudia grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to hurt through my jacket. The singing got closer, circling around us. Multiple voices now, harmonizing, but we couldn't see anyone. The metal door of the buried structure started rattling. The padlock was still secured, but the door itself was shaking in its frame, hard enough that snow was falling off the roof. The singing got louder, and I could hear words now, or at least I thought I could. The same phrase repeated over and over. It sounded like "Inti hitta vägen," but I didn't know what that meant. Claudia started running. Not back toward the trail, just away from the clearing, crashing through snow that was suddenly deeper than it should have been. I followed her, and we ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they'd collapse. We didn't stop when we hit the trail. We didn't stop when we saw the blue markers again. We ran until we could see the parking lot through the trees. The car started immediately, thank God. We didn't talk the entire drive back. Claudia dropped me at my apartment, and I told her I'd call her later. I didn't. She didn't call me either. 3 days later, I looked up that phrase I'd heard. "Inti hitta vägen." It's Swedish. It means "cannot find the way." Last month, Claudia texted me. First time we'd communicated since that day. The message just said, "Did you hear it last night?" I didn't respond because I had heard something. Singing, faint and far away, coming from the woods behind my apartment building. Woods that shouldn't even be there. I live in the middle of the city now. We haven't talked about going hiking again. Story 4. I inherited my grandmother's house in Bemidji after she passed in November. She'd lived alone there for 37 years, ever since my grandfather died. The house was old, built in the 1920s, and it needed work. The lawyer handling the estate said I should probably sell it, that the foundation had issues and the heating system was ancient. But I'd spent summers there as a kid, and I had good memories. I thought maybe I could fix it up, rent it out, or use it as a vacation place. I drove up from Rochester on a Friday afternoon in late January to assess what needed to be done. The house was on the east side of Lake Bemidji, set back from the road on 2 acres. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away. Snow was piled up to the first-floor windows, and the driveway hadn't been plowed since before my grandmother died. I parked on the road and hiked in. The key stuck in the lock, and when I finally got the door open, the smell hit me. Not decay, nothing like that, just old air, stale and cold. The electricity was still on, which surprised me. I flipped switches as I walked through, checking rooms. Everything was exactly how I remembered it. My grandmother's knitting basket by the fireplace, her reading glasses on the side table, photos covering every available surface. I was in the kitchen, going through cabinets and making notes on my phone, when I noticed the basement door was open. Just a crack, maybe an inch. I could feel cold air coming up from below, colder than the rest of the house. My grandmother had always kept that door locked. She said the basement was dangerous. The stairs were rotted, no reason for anyone to go down there. As a kid, I'd never questioned it. I should have left it alone. But I was 34 years old and the house was mine now, and I needed to know what condition the basement was in if I was going to sell or renovate. I pulled the door fully open and looked down. The stairs looked fine to me, old but solid. There was a light switch at the top, and when I flipped it, a bare bulb illuminated the space below. It was unfinished, just concrete walls and a dirt floor. Boxes were stacked along one wall, and there was an old furnace in the corner that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. The ceiling was low, maybe 6.5 feet, and I had to duck under pipes as I walked. The cold was intense, worse than it should have been even for an unheated basement in January. That's when I saw the marks, scratches on the concrete wall concentrated in one area. They were deep, deliberate, forming shapes I couldn't quite make sense of, not symbols exactly, more like maps or diagrams, lines connecting circles, arrows pointing to specific spots on the floor. I crouched down to look at where one arrow was pointing and saw the dirt had been disturbed there. Recently disturbed. The soil was loose, darker than the surrounding ground. I stood up quickly and backed toward the stairs. That's when I heard the voice, my grandmother's voice, clear as anything, saying my name, Thomas. I spun around, nothing. The basement was empty except for the boxes and the furnace and me. She said my name again, and this time I could tell it was coming from the corner where the furnace was. Behind the furnace. I ran up those stairs faster than I've ever moved. Slammed the basement door behind me and locked it with the deadbolt I'd seen on this side. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries. I could hear movement below now, not footsteps exactly, more like dragging, something being pulled across the dirt floor. I left the house immediately. Didn't grab my coat, didn't lock the front door, just got in my car and drove. I stopped at a gas station 10 miles down the road and called my cousin Bate Kowalski, told her I was signing over my inheritance to her if she wanted it. She asked what was wrong, said I sounded terrified. I told her the house needed too much work and I didn't have time to deal with it. She accepted, probably thought I was being flaky but didn't care enough to argue. 2 weeks later, Bate called me. She'd gone to the house to start clearing things out, found something in the basement I should know about. I told her I wasn't interested, but she kept talking. She'd dug where the soil had been disturbed, found bones. Not human, she said, animal bones arranged in patterns. And a journal, my grandmother's handwriting, detailing something she'd done in 1983 after my grandfather died, something she'd been maintaining ever since. Bate stopped talking then, and I heard her breathing get weird. She asked if I'd heard anything in the house when I was there. Any voices. I hung up without answering. She texted me later that night. 3 words. It knows Thomas. I changed my phone number the next day. Moved to Madison, Wisconsin a month after that. I don't know what Bate did with the house, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, I hear my grandmother's voice, not calling my name anymore, just humming that song she used to hum while she knitted. And I know somehow that she's not the one doing the humming. Story 5. I was working as a contractor for the DNR in February 2023, doing wildlife surveys in the northern part of the state. Most of it was checking trail cameras, documenting animal populations, pretty routine stuff. The pay was decent for seasonal work, and I liked being alone in the woods, better than dealing with people anyway. I'd just gotten out of a bad relationship and wasn't in the mood for company. The assignment that week was checking cameras along the Canadian border near a place called Hollow Creek. The name should have been my first clue, but I was more worried about the weather. The forecast was calling for a major storm system moving in, and I wanted to get the cameras checked before it hit. My supervisor, Angela Petrov, told me to take my time, said the storm probably wouldn't hit until evening. I headed out around noon. The access road was barely maintained, and my truck struggled through some of the deeper snow. I parked at a trailhead marked on my GPS and loaded up my pack with equipment, extra batteries, my lunch. The first 3 cameras were spaced about a mile apart, and I reached them without incident. Standard stuff on the memory cards: deer, fox, a coyote. I swapped batteries, cleared the cards, moved on. Camera 4 was off the main trail, about half a mile down what used to be a logging road. The coordinates put it near an old maple grove that the DNR was monitoring for disease. When I got there, the camera was missing, not fallen down or buried in snow, just gone. The mounting bracket was still attached to the tree, but the camera itself had been removed. The screws were on the ground below, arranged in a perfect circle. I radioed Angela, told her about the missing equipment. She said it was probably stolen, that it happened sometimes, just file a report and move on to camera 5. But something about those screws bothered me. Who steals a camera and then carefully arranges the screws in a circle? I took a photo of it, more for my own curiosity than anything official. Camera 5 was another mile north. I was checking my GPS when I noticed the footprints. They were running parallel to my path, maybe 15 feet to my left in the deeper snow between trees. Barefoot prints in February in Minnesota. I stopped walking and stared at them, trying to make sense of it. The prints were fresh, couldn't have been more than an hour old, and they were large, size 14 at least. I pulled out my radio to call it in, and that's when I saw the person, standing about 50 yards ahead, partially hidden behind a pine tree. Naked, just standing there, not moving, watching me. I could see pale skin, dark hair, a male figure. I shouted, asked if he needed help, said I had emergency supplies. He didn't respond, didn't move. I started walking toward him slowly, keeping my radio in hand. I got within 30 feet when he stepped fully into view, and I stopped. His skin wasn't just pale, it was wrong, gray-white like meat that had been frozen and thawed. His eyes were too large and they didn't blink. He was smiling, but the smile was all wrong, too wide, showing gums and too many teeth. Then he started walking toward me. Not running, just walking with steady, measured steps. His feet didn't sink into the snow the way mine did. They barely left impressions. I backed up, told him to stay where he was, reached for the pepper spray on my belt. He kept coming, that smile never wavering, his eyes locked on mine. I ran, dropped my pack, kept the radio, and ran back the way I'd come. I could hear him behind me, not running either, just walking at that same steady pace. But he was keeping up. I was sprinting, falling in the snow, getting up, sprinting again. And he was always the same distance behind me. I could hear his breathing, raspy and wet. I made it back to my truck, fumbled with the keys, got the door open, turned the engine over, and it started immediately, thank God. I looked in the rearview mirror and he was standing at the edge of the tree line, still smiling, watching me leave. I drove straight back to the ranger station, told Angela everything. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but she called it in anyway. They sent a team out the next day to search the area. Found my pack right where I dropped it. Found the missing camera hanging from a tree about a quarter mile from where it should have been. The memory card was full of images from the previous night. Hundreds of photos, all taken at 1-minute intervals. Every single one showed the same thing, a close-up of a face pressed against the camera lens. Gray-white skin, too large eyes, that wide, terrible smile. The last photo on the card was taken about 10 minutes before I'd arrived at that location. In it, the face was pulling back from the camera, and you could see an arm reaching up. Long fingers, too many joints ending in black nails. The hand was holding the screws from the mounting bracket. They asked me if I wanted to continue the contract. I said no. I've been doing construction work in Mankato ever since, and I don't go into the woods anymore. Not for any reason. But sometimes I dream about that smile, and I wake up convinced someone's standing at the foot of my bed, watching. The feeling usually passes after a few minutes. Usually. Story 6. My brother-in-law Jake Sorensen owned a hunting cabin near Finland, about 15 miles north of Highway 61. He'd bought it cheap at an estate sale, planned to fix it up and use it for deer season. The previous owner had died without family, and the property had sat vacant for 3 years before Jake found the listing. He asked me to come up with him for a weekend in March to assess what needed repairs. I just finished a carpentry apprenticeship and owed Jake a favor for co-signing my truck loan. We drove up on a Saturday morning, stopping in 2 harbors for supplies. Jake was excited, talking about how the cabin had supposedly been used by bootleggers during Prohibition, how there might be hidden compartments or tunnels. I mostly listened and watched the snow-covered landscape pass by. The turnoff to the cabin was unmarked, just a narrow path between pines that Jake had to navigate carefully. The cabin itself was bigger than I'd expected, 2 stories with a loft, probably built in the 30s. The exterior logs were rotting in places and several windows were cracked, but the roof looked intact and the foundation seemed solid. We unloaded Jake's truck and went inside. The smell hit me immediately. Damp wood, mildew, and something else I couldn't identify. Sweet and rotten at the same time. The interior was mostly empty. A few pieces of furniture covered in stained sheets, a wood stove in the main room, a staircase leading up to the loft. Jake started opening windows to air the place out while I checked the structure. The walls were sound, the floor needed work but wasn't dangerous. I was measuring a window frame when Jake called me over to the stove. He'd moved it aside to check the wall behind it, and there was a door. Not a normal door, more like a hatch cut into the floor, hidden beneath where the stove had been. The wood was old, but the hinges looked newer, maybe replaced in the last decade. There was no lock, just a rope handle. Jake grabbed the handle and pulled. The door lifted easily, revealing a ladder leading down into darkness. I told him we should leave it alone, that we didn't have proper lighting and didn't know how stable the structure was down there. Jake pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, shined it down into the hole. The ladder went down about 12 feet and ended at what looked like a dirt floor. He said he was going to check it out, asked if I was coming. I reluctantly agreed. The space below was larger than I'd expected, maybe 20 by 20 feet. The walls were lined with shelves that held old jars and cans, most of them empty or rotted through. Jake was right about the bootlegger theory. There were old bottles everywhere, some still full of clear liquid. But there was more than that. In the far corner, someone had built something, a frame of lashed branches about the size of a person hanging from the ceiling. Strips of cloth were woven through the branches in intricate patterns, and in the center hung a burlap sack, lumpy and stained. Jake walked over to it, reached out to touch the sack. I told him not to, but he was already pulling at the cord that held it closed. The sack opened and something spilled out onto the dirt floor. Bones. Animal bones, I thought at first. Then I saw the skull. Too large to be a dog, too small to be a deer. Human, a child's skull, yellowed with age. We both stepped back. Jake dropped his phone and the light went out. For a second, we were in complete darkness. Then we heard the breathing, not from each other, from somewhere else in the space. Long, wheezing breaths that echoed off the dirt walls. Jake found his phone, turned the light back on. The frame of branches was swinging now, moving on its own. The breathing got louder. I grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him toward the ladder. We climbed up as fast as we could, and I slammed the hatch door shut behind us. Jake wanted to push the stove back over it, but I said we needed to leave immediately. He argued for maybe 10 seconds before we heard the sound below us. Scratching, something scratching at the underside of the hatch door. We left everything. Supplies, tools, Jake's laptop that he'd brought to document the renovation. Got in his truck and drove back to Highway 61 without speaking. We stopped at a diner in Two Harbors and Jake said we should call the police, report what we found. I asked him what exactly we'd report, that we found old bones in a cabin Jake now owned, that we heard breathing in an empty cellar. Jake never went back. He tried to sell the property, but no one was interested. Eventually, he just stopped paying the taxes on it, let the county have it. We don't talk about what happened, and we don't go up to the North Shore anymore. But 3 months after that day, Jake showed me something he'd found on his phone. A photo he didn't remember taking. It was from inside the cellar, and it showed the frame of branches. In the photo, the burlap sack was open and empty, but something was standing behind the frame, partially visible between the cloth strips, something tall and thin and impossibly pale. The photo timestamp said it was taken while we were climbing the ladder, while Jake's phone was in his pocket. Story 7. I was driving home from Fargo to Minneapolis on Highway 10 in January, one of those trips I'd made 100 times. It was late after midnight and I was tired. I'd been visiting my mom for her birthday and stayed longer than planned. The highway was empty, snow piled up on both sides, my headlights cutting through the darkness. The radio had lost signal about 30 miles back, and I was driving in silence. Somewhere between Wadena and Little Falls, my check engine light came on. Then the temperature gauge started climbing. I swore, pulled over to the shoulder, and popped the hood. Steam was billowing out. I'm not a mechanic, but even I could tell something had ruptured. Coolant was leaking onto the snow below, creating dark stains. My phone showed 1 bar of signal, and I called for a tow truck. The dispatcher said it would be at least 90 minutes, maybe longer because of the weather. I got back in the car and tried to stay warm, running the engine in 5-minute intervals to keep from freezing. That's when I noticed the house. It was back from the road maybe 300 feet, partially hidden by trees. I hadn't seen it when I'd pulled over, but now it was visible through the bare branches. A farmhouse, 2 stories, lights on in the downstairs windows, smoke coming from the chimney. I sat there for 20 minutes, getting colder despite running the engine. Finally, I decided to walk up to the house and ask if I could wait inside. The temperature was dropping, and 90 minutes in a car with no heat was dangerous. I grabbed my phone and started walking, following what looked like a driveway, though it hadn't been plowed recently. The house looked older up close, maybe built in the 40s or 50s. The paint was peeling, and some of the shutters hung at odd angles. But the windows were definitely lit, and I could see movement inside. I climbed the porch steps and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder, still nothing. I tried the doorknob and it turned easily. The door swung open. The interior was warm, almost hot. A fire was burning in a stone fireplace, and oil lamps were lit throughout the room. Old furniture, a braided rug, floral wallpaper that was yellowed with age, but no people. I called out, said I had car trouble and just needed a place to wait for the tow truck. My voice echoed in the empty house. I walked further in, checking rooms. A kitchen with a wood stove still warm, a pot of something on the burner, a parlor with a record player that wasn't playing but looked like it had been recently. Stairs leading up to the 2nd floor. I climbed them slowly, calling out the whole time. 3 bedrooms, all empty. Made beds, old quilts, photographs on the walls showing people I didn't recognize. A bathroom with a clawfoot tub and no running water. I went back downstairs, and that's when I noticed the clock on the mantel. It was running, the second hand moving smoothly, but it was showing the wrong time, not off by an hour for daylight saving or a different time zone, off by days. The date window showed February 14th. It was January 23rd. Then I heard the front door close. I spun around, no one there, but the door was shut now, even though I'd left it open. I walked over and tried the knob. Locked. I pulled harder, then threw my weight against it. The door didn't budge. I checked the windows. They were painted shut, and the glass was too thick to break easily. I was trapped in this house that shouldn't exist, that had been empty but was now locked with me inside. I pulled out my phone. No signal anymore. The battery was draining rapidly, dropping from 70% to 40% while I watched. I tried the back door, also locked. Every window painted shut. The temperature in the house was rising. I was sweating now, my jacket too heavy. That's when I heard the footsteps upstairs. Slow, heavy steps moving across the floor above me. Back and forth, pacing. I hadn't checked the closets. Maybe someone had been hiding, watching me search. I grabbed a poker from the fireplace and stood at the bottom of the stairs. The footsteps continued, always in the same pattern. Then they stopped. Silence for maybe 10 seconds. Then the steps started coming down the stairs. I could see the stairs from where I stood, but nothing was there. No one was descending, but I could hear it clearly, each step creaking under weight. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. I was staring at empty air, but I could feel presence, something standing 3 feet from me, breathing. The air in front of me wavered like heat rising off asphalt. I ran for the front door again, hitting it with my shoulder. The wood cracked. I hit it again, and this time it splintered. I forced my way through, tearing my jacket on the broken wood, and fell onto the porch. The cold air hit me like a wall. I scrambled down the steps and ran toward the highway, not looking back, my breath coming in gasps that burned my lungs. My car was where I'd left it, and the tow truck was pulling up behind it. The driver got out, asked if I was okay, said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't answer, just got in the truck's cab and waited while he hooked up my car. I looked back at the house. The lights were still on, but the smoke from the chimney was gone. The whole place looked abandoned now, even from a distance. The driver dropped me at a hotel in Little Falls. The next day I had my car towed to a shop and rented another one to drive home. Before I left, I looked up the property on my phone using the GPS coordinates from where I'd broken down. The map showed nothing but empty farmland. No house, no driveway. According to county records, there had been a farmhouse there once. It burned down in 1952, killing the family inside. No structure had existed on that property since. My jacket still has the tear from the door, and sometimes late at night I smell wood smoke in my apartment, even though there's no fireplace. Story 8. I work for a utility company based out of Hibbing, doing line maintenance in the northern part of the state. It's mostly routine, replacing insulators, checking for damage after storms. In early February, I got assigned to check a series of towers running through the Superior National Forest. The last inspection had been 6 months prior, and with the heavy snowfall we'd had, there was concern about trees falling on the lines. I was working solo that day, which was normal for low-priority routes. My supervisor, Rita Holloway, gave me the access codes for the service roads and told me to be back before dark. The first 3 towers were fine, some ice buildup but nothing that couldn't wait until spring. Tower 4 was deeper into the forest, accessible only by snowmobile. I loaded my equipment onto the company machine and headed out around noon. The trail was rougher than expected, and it took me 40 minutes to reach the tower. When I got there, I saw immediately that something was wrong. The tower itself was fine, but there were objects hanging from the lower crossbeams. At first I thought they were bird nests or debris that had gotten caught in the wind. Then I got closer and realized they were arranged deliberately, small bundles of sticks bound with what looked like hair, at least a dozen of them, hanging at different heights. I took photos for my report and radioed Rita. The signal was weak, but I got through enough to tell her what I'd found. She said vandalism wasn't uncommon in remote areas, just document it and move on. But as I was photographing the bundles, I noticed something else. Tracks in the snow around the tower, human tracks I thought at first, barefoot, which made no sense in this weather, and they circled the tower multiple times, forming a spiral pattern. I followed the tracks away from the tower with my eyes, and they disappeared into the tree line about 50 feet away. Against my better judgment, I walked over to see where they led. The tracks continued into the forest, still in that spiral pattern, getting wider as they went. After a few minutes of following them, I came to a clearing I hadn't noticed on the survey maps. In the center of the clearing was a structure, not a cabin or a tent, something else. It looked like it had grown there or been built from living trees that had been forced into unnatural shapes. Branches woven together, still attached to their trunks but bent and twisted to form walls. And inside this structure, I could see movement. I stopped at the edge of the clearing. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, get back on the snowmobile and leave. But I was curious and stupid. I called out, asked if anyone was there. The movement inside the structure stopped, complete stillness. Then something emerged. It looked human from a distance. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But as it came closer, I saw the details that were wrong. The arms were too long, hanging past the knees. The head was elongated, like someone had grabbed the skull and pulled it upward. The skin was pale but had a translucent quality, and I could see dark shapes moving beneath it, veins maybe or something else. It didn't make a sound as it walked toward me. No footsteps in the snow, no breathing, just smooth, gliding movement. I backed up, reaching for my radio, and that's when I saw there were more of them. 3 others emerging from the trees around the clearing. They were all moving toward me in that same gliding way, and they were starting to circle me. I ran, not back the way I'd come, just away from them. My boots were too heavy for the deep snow, and I kept falling. I could hear them behind me, not chasing exactly, but following, keeping pace. I made it back to the snowmobile, fumbling with the key start. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, and I gunned it back toward the service road. I looked back once. They were standing in a line where the tree line met the trail, watching me leave. 4 figures, perfectly still, their 2 long arms hanging at their sides. As I watched, they all raised one arm in unison and pointed at me. Then I lost sight of them around a bend. I made it back to my truck in record time, loaded the snowmobile, and drove straight to the office. Rita was confused by my report, asked if I'd hit my head or gotten carbon monoxide poisoning. I showed her the photos. The bundles were clearly visible in the images, but when she zoomed in on one photo, there was something else. In the background, partially hidden by the tower structure, you could see the edge of the clearing, and standing at that edge was a pale figure, its arm raised, pointing at the camera. Rita filed the report as vandalism and told me to take a few days off. I've been back at work for 2 months now, doing routes closer to town. They haven't sent anyone back to check Tower 4. According to the system, it's been marked as temporarily inaccessible due to terrain. But I know that's not why, because last week I found something on my truck's hood, a small bundle of sticks bound with hair, identical to the ones hanging from the tower. It was sitting in the center of the hood when I left work, perfectly placed. I threw it in a dumpster and washed my hands until they were raw. But this morning there was another one, on my doorstep. Story 9. My girlfriend Nora Patterson and I rented a cabin on Leech Lake for a long weekend in March. We'd been together for 2 years and talked about getting engaged, and I thought a romantic getaway might be the right time to propose. I'd bought the ring the month before and had been carrying it around, waiting for the perfect moment. The cabin was on the western shore, isolated, with no neighbors visible from the windows. We arrived on a Friday evening, unloaded our bags, and settled in. The cabin was nicer than the photos had suggested, all modern appliances and comfortable furniture. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the frozen lake. Nora loved it immediately, took about 100 photos for Instagram. We made dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and watched the sunset over the ice. It was perfect. That night, we were sitting by the fireplace when Nora pointed at the window. She said she'd seen a light on the lake moving back and forth. I looked but didn't see anything. She insisted, said it had been there a second ago, like a flashlight or lantern. I suggested it might have been a reflection or maybe someone ice fishing, though it seemed late for that. We watched for a few more minutes, saw nothing, and went to bed. I woke up around 3 a.m. to find Nora standing at the bedroom window, looking out at the lake. I asked if she was okay, and she didn't respond at first. Then she said there were people on the ice. I got up and looked. The moon was bright, reflecting off the snow, and I could see the lake clearly. Nothing. No people, no lights, no movement. I told Nora she must have been dreaming, and she let me guide her back to bed. But she kept insisting she'd seen them, a whole group of people standing in a circle on the ice. The next morning, she didn't remember it. I mentioned what she'd said about the people on the lake, and she laughed, said she'd been sleepwalking, which she did occasionally when stressed. We had breakfast and decided to go for a walk on the lake. The ice was thick, safe, and the view was beautiful. We bundled up and headed out. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when we found the circle. Exactly what Nora had described, though she claimed not to remember saying it. The snow on the ice had been cleared in a perfect circle about 30 feet across, and in the center of the circle was a hole. The ice had been cut away, revealing dark water beneath. The hole was large, maybe 6 feet in diameter, and the edges were clean, like someone had used a saw. We stood at the edge of the cleared circle, looking at the hole. There was no fishing equipment, no signs of what had made it or why. Nora said we should go back to the cabin, and I agreed. But as we turned to leave, she grabbed my arm. She was pointing at the snow around the circle. There were footprints everywhere, dozens of them, all circling the hole, but none of them led away. They just stopped at the edge of the circle, like whoever made them had vanished. We walked faster back to the cabin, not quite running, but close. Neither of us spoke. When we got inside, Nora locked the door and pulled all the curtains closed. She said something was wrong with this place, that we should pack up and leave. I wanted to agree, but it was already getting dark, and I didn't want to drive the narrow roads back to the highway in the dark. I suggested we stay one more night, leave first thing in the morning. She reluctantly agreed. We tried to have a normal evening, made dinner, played cards, avoided looking at the windows. Around 10, we went to bed. I just started to drift off when I heard it. Footsteps on the roof. Heavy, deliberate steps pacing back and forth above our bedroom. Nora was already awake, staring at the ceiling. The footsteps continued for maybe a minute, then stopped. We waited in silence. Then we heard them outside on the deck. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shined it toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see shadows moving beyond them. Multiple shadows pressed against the glass. Nora was crying now, telling me to call someone to do something. I dialed 911, but there was no signal. The footsteps were all around the cabin now, circling it. Then they stopped, complete silence. We stayed in bed, frozen for what felt like hours. Eventually the sun started to rise, and we gathered our stuff as quickly as we could. I didn't care about the engagement anymore, didn't care about anything except getting out of there. We threw everything in the car and started driving. Neither of us looked back at the cabin. About 5 miles down the road, Nora gasped and pointed at the windshield. There was something stuck under the wiper blade, a piece of fabric frozen stiff. I stopped the car and got out to remove it. It was a scarf, hand-knitted, stained with something dark. And wrapped inside the scarf was a note written in shaky handwriting, "Not alone." We never reported what happened, never contacted the cabin's owner. I don't even know if we could find it again if we tried. But 2 weeks later, I was going through the photos Nora had taken that first evening. In one of them, taken through the window at sunset, you can see the lake, and if you zoom in on the ice, there are figures, dark shapes standing in a circle, exactly where we found the cleared snow the next day. Nora and I broke up a month later. She said she couldn't stop thinking about that place, that she heard footsteps on her apartment roof every night. I told her she was imagining it, but I hear them too. Wherever I go, I hear footsteps above me, pacing, waiting. Story 10. I was 41 when I decided to scatter my father's ashes in the Boundary Waters. He'd loved that area, spent every summer of his retirement camping and fishing up there. When he passed in December, his will specified that he wanted his ashes spread at a place called Echo Point, a remote peninsula he'd discovered years ago. I'd never been there with him, but he'd left detailed directions. I drove up in mid-March, when the ice was starting to break up, but the trails were still accessible. I was alone, which felt appropriate. My father and I had never been close, and this trip felt more like fulfilling an obligation than a gesture of love. I had a small wooden box with his ashes, a map he'd annotated, and enough supplies for 2 days. The hike to Echo Point was longer than I'd expected, about 8 miles from the nearest parking area. The trail was muddy where the snow had melted, and I had to cross several streams that were running high with spring runoff. It took me most of the day to reach the coordinates my father had marked. When I got there, I understood why he'd loved it. The peninsula jutted out into a lake that was still mostly frozen, surrounded by old-growth pines. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional crack of shifting ice. I set up my small tent at the base of the peninsula, ate a cold dinner, and planned to scatter the ashes at sunset. That's when I found the cairn. It was built on the highest point of the peninsula, a careful stack of stones about 4 feet tall. At the base was a metal plate, weathered but still readable. It had my father's name on it. Below his name were dates, his birth date and the current year. Not the year he died, but this year, March 15th, today's date. And below the dates was an inscription. Waiting here. My mouth went dry. This didn't make sense. My father had died in December and I had his ashes in the box. But this cairn was here with today's date, like he'd known I'd come today, like he'd been waiting. I pulled out my phone to take a photo, and that's when I noticed I had no signal, and my battery was at 5%, even though it had been fully charged an hour ago. The sun was setting fast and the temperature was dropping. I decided to scatter the ashes and leave at first light, forget about trying to understand the cairn. I walked to the edge of the peninsula, opened the wooden box and tipped it to release the ashes into the wind, but nothing came out. I shook the box, still nothing. I opened it fully and looked inside. The box was empty. It had been empty the whole time. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. I'd felt the weight of the box when I'd packed it, when I'd carried it on the hike. But now it was empty, and I couldn't remember actually seeing the ashes, just taking the sealed box from the funeral home. I was standing there, trying to understand, when I heard the voice behind me. "Thank you for coming." It was my father's voice. I spun around and he was standing by the cairn. He looked exactly like I remembered, wearing the flannel shirt he'd always loved, his fishing hat, his boots, but his eyes were wrong. Too dark, like they were reflecting nothing, and he wasn't quite solid. I could see the trees through him faintly. I couldn't speak. He smiled, that same smile I remembered from childhood, but it didn't reach those dark eyes. He said he'd been waiting, that this place was special, that he'd made certain arrangements. I asked what he meant, and he gestured at the cairn. He said everyone in his family came here eventually, that it was tradition. That one day I'd understand and I'd bring my children here too. I ran, left my tent, my supplies, everything. I ran back down that trail in the dark, falling and getting up and running more. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and I drove straight through the night back to Minneapolis. I never looked back, never checked the rearview mirror, terrified of what I might see. 3 days later, I got a call from the ranger station near where I'd been. They'd found my tent and wanted to know if I was okay, if I'd left in an emergency. I told them I'd gotten sick and would come back for my gear. They said not to bother. Someone had already dismantled the tent and brought everything to the station, along with a note. The note had my name on it and just one line, "See you next March 15th. That was 4 months ago. I've tried to forget about it, tried to convince myself it was hypothermia or stress or grief playing tricks on me. But 2 weeks ago, I found something in my mailbox. A stone from the cairn, I'm certain of it. The same weathered granite, the same shape. And attached to it was a new metal plate with an inscription, counting down. It's March now. And I can't stop thinking about that peninsula, about my father standing by the cairn, about that tradition he mentioned. I've started having dreams where I'm walking that trail again, carrying a box that gets heavier with each step. And in the dreams, when I reach Echo Point, I'm not alone. There are others there, all standing by cairns with their names on them, all waiting for March 15th. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories from the frozen wilderness of Minnesota, hit that like button and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there, and maybe think twice before venturing into those snowy woods alone.